can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Wise here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders like the founders of RX Bars, which I had no idea at the time how big they were until I got a text that said they sold to Kellogg for $600 million. Check out that interview with Peter. P90X founder Tony Horton talks about it. You know, you hear, Sean, about people making hundreds of millions of dollars, but he started off as a street mime. So he would make his food and rent money putting a hat on the street to make the money for the food in an apartment. I love hearing those stories. The founder of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, talks about, he was Steve Jobs' mentor, and he talked about how Steve offered him 33% of Apple for $50,000 and why he said no. Imagine that. This episode is brought to you by Rise 25, which I co-founded with my business partner, John Corcoran. And our mission is to connect you with your best referral partners and customers. And we do that for people for what's been the best thing for my business and my life, which is a podcast. I believe it's been the best thing to help me connect and give to the people in my network and profile them. And we help the company completely run and launch your podcast. We distribute it across all the channels, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. And so you can show up and talk, spread your thought leadership, have your guests on, and we do everything else. I credit it to be the single best thing I've done. It's not just a business. It's about leaving a legacy. This is how John, we're going to talk actually about how Sean, some of these groups have impacted his personal life, but I met my business partners through podcasting, best friends. We go on vacations together, and it also helps you leave a legacy for you and your guest. And so if you have, I don't talk about much about this, Sean, and John told me to talk more about it, but the inspiration behind it is really my grandfather, who was a Holocaust survivor who escaped Nazi Germany. And the Holocaust Foundation interviewed my grandfather about his story, just atrocities that he had to endure. And that his legacy lives on because of that interview. And it's on my about page on inspiredinsider.com. So if you want to check it out. But if you have a question about starting a podcast in general, I think if you're a business, you should do it 100%. It doesn't mean we have to run it for you. If you have questions, email support@rise25.com, and we're happy to answer them so you and your guests can leave a legacy. I'm excited. Today we have Sean Magennis, president and COO of YPO. Talk about making an impact, because YPO, if you haven't heard of it, it's a global community of chief executives dedicated to becoming better leaders. And it's a platform that has more than 27,000 members in more than 138 countries. In my opinion and other people's opinions, YPO is arguably one of the most powerful groups in the world. To qualify, a member has to have at least $10 million in annual sales. I was listening to you and Cameron Harold talk. People, shout out to Cameron Harold and his podcast, but he was talking about how, I guess, the members of YPO in Thailand make up like a 30% of the GDP or something, who are involved in YPO because of the global impact and the national impact you guys and your members have. Sean began his career in South Africa, one of the country's largest producer of agricultural chemicals, and he founded an organizational development consulting business and an executive search business. And currently is an advisor of two companies. Shout out to Nuooly. It's Nuooly, which is a gig economy business for independent attorneys, and REM Brothers, REM Brothers, which is a hospitality and food service business. So if you're near Purdue University, near Lafayette or Dallas, check it out. Sean, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Jeremy. What a pleasure being with you. And just teeing off of your comment about your grandparents in the Holocaust, I've had the privilege of visiting Yad Vashem in Jerusalem several times over in 20-year gaps in between, and I can't tell you such a moving and emotional experience, and what anchors it for me, and it's what you and John are doing, is you're connecting people with authentic stories, and you're paying it forward by leveraging the lessons learned. And I was just there in May again, and watched was at Yad Vashem and listened and watched the testimony from a survivor that it was just so extraordinary. And her story was she was saved as a child, and looked after by a French family, and she literally still goes back every year to this farmhouse. Remarkable story. Anyway, I didn't mean to digress, but
this is what it's about. There's no digression. It's wherever they, like I said. What made you go to Israel?
Well, my YPO chapter was doing its chapter retreat, and my wife and I hosted 20 couples at one of our signature events called Touch Israel, run by members from our Israeli chapters. It's just extraordinary what this group of members is able to do in 4 days. It's really a deep dive, immersive deep dive into the culture, the Israeli culture, the Palestinian culture, all of the issues in that region.
Talk about complexity.
Oh my gosh, talk about complexity. And by the way, this incredible underlying willingness to work together for a cause which is greater than ourselves, which is literally, how do we make things better? How do we embrace diversity of opinion, and not get sucked into, hatred and, agendas, etc. I mean, that we could take a year and not get through that discussion.
Yeah. No, I love hearing your thoughts on that because, hearing someone like that, a survivor or whatever it is, it could be, a CEO or someone going through a crappy time. And oftentimes we only see the surface level stuff, like things are going perfectly. And I love hearing those stories, or I watched the interview he did and hearing those things because it's humbling and it puts perspective on things. And, John and I always talk about, let's say we're having a bad day or something's not going right. I'm like, well, at least I wasn't, my home wasn't burned out and I had to live in the woods for 3 weeks. Like I can go back to that and be like, okay, like really in the grand scheme of things, I'm okay,
Absolutely. And, we grow up in the United States and first world countries with this very naively privileged perspective, where, particularly those individuals who don't travel. And I always encourage, starting as young as you possibly can to travel affordably, but go and see the rest of the world. Go and see how incredibly fortunate we are, particularly in the United States. And by the way, the most giving culture in the world is the United States. We're so generous and we're so philanthropic. But we also get bent around the axle with things that are just not important to talk about when you see how suffering exists in other places in the world. Anyway, and I still think we're an incredible beacon of light to the rest of the world, and we should be. And that's something that, I personally am very, very, very keen to talk, and I talk to friends about it a lot, and, debate and civil discourse. If we can have a rational debate today, which is increasingly more difficult, it's how do we maintain those principles and that beacon of light, because that's what helps the world get better.
Yeah, I want to talk about growing up in South Africa and what that was like, but I want to start with, obviously you've had a lot of success in business, and helping run one of the most powerful organizations. What's been, when you think back, on the challenge thing and tough times thing, what's been a big challenge or tough period that you had to push through to get to where you are?
I think the first big one was really leaving South Africa. It's never easy to leave the country of origin, all your connections, your family. That was difficult.
How old were you?
I was 25. And, it was still in the midst of apartheid in South Africa. It was a very difficult time. I just finished, a stint in the infantry, in the military service, and then finished university, and I'd worked for a couple of years. And, at the time, if I had a crystal ball, my decision might have been different, but, I didn't see the kind of successful resolution that occurred in South Africa. It was a remarkable thing that people like Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu and Frederick W. de Klerk, the apartheid era president, who really galvanized with those two gentlemen and many, many others. Lots of YPOs, by the way, participated in helping that go through. But, it was that was probably the most difficult. And then going through a business failure. I had a very significant failure in 2008 with the, collapse of the financial markets. I was at the time involved in a real estate business building low-income housing. And my wife, who is a fellow EO member, we met through EO, parents of YPO, We were both in real estate, different ends of the market, and within a week, all of the capital dried up, and
That's crazy.
That was a significant setback because you're not prepared for it.
Real estate 2008, don't mix.
Don't mix.
Yeah, God. So what do you do at that time? Like things.
I think it's about resilience. I think it's about grit. It's about the people that you surround yourself with. It's the friends that you've made over the years and the contacts. And, it's being smart enough to have, some kind of safety blanket. So my wife and I are big savers, for example, and it's very important to have that rainy day money. Doesn't have to be a lot. And then also, we found living within our means, we were not stretched from a cost perspective, and that enabled us to tack left, pivot, both get involved in different things and literally pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, and we had each other. I think that's such an important
The support system
of my success, my life experience has been having a phenomenal partner to go through these things with.
and a support system. At the time, were you in an organization?
I was, and YPO was incredible at that time, not just for me, but for many individuals whose businesses were significantly impacted around the world. I mean, you remember it. It was devastating for
Terrible.
some people. And in fact, I think that's where organizations like YPO are really the strongest, is at times
Tough times.
where we can help each other.
Sean, you help oversee an organization of more than 27,000 members. What's the hardest part about your job?
Oh, boy. I think probably balancing interests, different interests, and making sure that
A lot of different interests.
lot of different interests, making sure that those interests align, and making sure that that from a communication standpoint, individuals understand the big picture, the cause, and really focus on the value and outcome, as opposed to I've got a particular beef or I want to be I want my priority to be number one. Helping them understand that we're an ecosystem, we're a freighter, going down a particular path, and we've got commitments, we've got things on the go, and so it's balancing all of that. And then part of that is really keeping the eye on the prize, and the eye on the prize is really being a steward and providing a platform for extraordinary connections for extraordinary people. And if you keep your eye on the prize, that can solve a lot of the day-to-day realities of running any business, quite frankly.
Yeah. So the eye on the prize and the underlying, the value that you provide, so that you kind of use that as a North Star to make certain decisions.
What beautiful phrase, North Star. I mean, that's exactly what it's about.
You mentioned your mom obviously had a big impact on you. I wanted you to talk about growing up in South Africa. What was it like? How does that influence you?
It was almost an idyllic. Life is never idyllic, right? As I said, but both my parents were hardworking people, both entrepreneurs. My mother was one of 10 girls. My grandmother had 10 girls.
Wow, seriously.
32 first cousins. It's pretty amazing.
Wow.
All great people. I was very close to all my aunts. And they grew up, they were Second World War era family. So they grew up, my grandmother had butcheries, and they had very little, but they managed to.
How do you even feed 10 kids? I mean,
that's a great
they go through like loaves of bread every day. I mean, that's insane.
And girls, how do you feed and clothe them? For a period of time.
No idea.
She was sent to a convent for a period of time. Because my grandmother was juggling, so she went off for a couple of years to the Newcastle Academy because she was juggling too many things. But you know what, people, this is where your question earlier about how do you get through tough times, when you've got love, when you've got a community, when you're built with grit and determination, and I think, the concept of the greatest generation, the greater the trial, that one faces, if you've got the community and you've got, and you've got that, I suppose, that
like support
framework
network
of love around you, you can get through a lot. So it was a fascinating time growing up. I was very blessed that my mother had very dear friends, a Mauritian South African family called the Ray family, who were I would say instrumental in my life in terms of providing, the kinds of familial relationships that I still respect and admire today. These extended relationships between families, are starting to dissipate somewhat. We would spend vacations at our friends' homes. We would do Christmases together, New Year's together, and so that growing up was amazing. I think another big part of growing up is my parents had a African gentleman by the name of Peter Ndlovu as their houseman, their house manager, who was with us for my whole formative time growing up. And there's a book in this, by the way, because it's a very emotional story, but he was not allowed to leave our house after 6 o'clock at night. He had to have a pass to work and live in our neighborhood. All these just bizarre, dehumanizing apartheid rules. But, the bond that I formed with him and he was like a third parent. And you speak to my sister, my brother, there was just this incredible recognition, one, that something was wrong, but oh my God, what an amazing man and what an amazing relationship. And then just the beauty of the country. It's an extraordinary extraordinary group of people, extraordinary place geographically, so much potential. So it was a privilege growing up, despite the very strange, bizarre circumstances, that people were living in.
Yeah, you mentioned the emotional part for him. What was his sentiments that he described to you about it?
One, he had to be very careful in public in the way that he treated us, touched us. He was a very physical guy. So, he would put us to bed every night. He would hug us. When we had fell out of a tree and, sliced a leg or something, he'd be the person to patch us up. And many years later, I retained my relationship with him until he died. But, my parents got divorced and he went to work for a really dear friend of my parents, and I'd go and see him every year. And in his room, there were pictures of, my sister, brother, myself, and he literally called us his babies.
Yeah.
So, the difficulty for him was his inability to express that very important part of his life. And excuse the emotion, but
yeah,
it was very tough for him. But he didn't dwell on it. He just retained this sort of unconditional care, deep affection for us, and we retained that same relationship, even though we'd moved 700 miles away. There was no daily connectivity. Certainly from the time we were teenagers. Then after I emigrated, I saw him less frequently. But the indelible lessons that, excuse me, that he left was people are people, and when you're loved and cared for, race disappears, color of skin disappears.
Right.
Profound lesson.
Yeah. To you, it's normal, because you live and to hug someone. It doesn't matter, like the color of their skin, their religion, but someone else who didn't experience that. I mean, it's hard for someone who didn't live that and experience it to probably even grasp what you're saying,
Mm-hmm. My brother Greg does a lot of great work. He's got a diversity business, and he goes and he teaches big companies, big Fortune 500 companies. And kind of as a white guy, having grown up in South Africa under apartheid, he's there up on in front of these groups, and he's leading sessions on the importance of authentically understang how you can connect at a human level. And it's tough for people. If you've not experienced it, to your point, how do you delayer that? How do you take all of those life experiences where somebody has told you that person is bad because of that? that religious group is nasty because of that. How do you delayer that? So, and we all have it within us, by the way. I mean, I have seen miraculous things, particularly through YPO, where we don't advocate. We are not religious. We don't take a political advocacy position. And when you put people together who you wouldn't even think would have the ability to talk to each other in a trusted environment, it just miracles happen. And that's what gives me hope in the world, by the way, because I see it all the time.
Yeah. First of all, Sean, thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate it, and thank you for sharing your stories. And I just want to be the first one to thank you for taking your time and sharing your wisdom. And on my list, I haven't read it yet, but Born a Crime by Trevor Noah is on my list to read. I don't know if you've read it or heard of it, but it's kind of a crazy story, and that's definitely on my to-do list.
You've got to read it, and he's a great South African export. I just can't say enough about him. In fact, he came to speak to in March this year. We had him as our closing keynote at a big event for over 3,000 members in Cape Town. And he got a 5-minute standing ovation.
Wow.
And he's the real deal. I grew up very privileged in South Africa. He didn't. And not that my life's any less important than his, but what an incredible, an amazing human being, a truly amazing guy.
Yeah. So thank you, Sean, for sharing your story. Where should we point people towards? I mean, obviously, we could send them to ypo.org.
ypo.org. We'd love to, if you're a CEO in any part of the world and you run a qualifying business and you'd like to both give back and learn and be part of a community where it's about, putting in as much as you put in, you'll get out. That's a promise and guarantee from me. We'd love to have you look at it. And
awesome.
Jeremy, just thank you. What an absolute pleasure, and thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you. Check out ypo.org. Thank you.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.